Okay.
Shall we get going?
Yes, yeah. The floor's all yours, MC. Take it away.
Once again, who's to know? Okay, so let me try and take you through some of these slides. It's interesting to hear how people describe what I'm probably going to be doing. It's been billed as kind of a human-computer interaction talk, but it's not necessarily about that. It's sort of what HCI types might do preliminarily to doing design. So hence this first talk slide is to look at the idea of what is sustainable food if we start by what we mean by green in this context. And for HCI, which is human-computer interaction, a human design-centered approach would ask, well, where does the person come in contact with the food? And fundamentally, food is about real consumption. So let me see if we can get us to this next slide with a screaming override. So we're going to focus a little bit tonight on actually where consumers consume and how by focusing on that, we can actually improve the notion of green food and green food technology by looking at how to design for this point of contact. If anybody has questions or didn't hear something, poke that lovely gentleman who was just talking for no reason whatsoever. Just poke him and let him know, and he'll let me know. Okay, so the first motivating principle behind what I'm going to be talking about here is this lovely quotation from somebody who's been looking at food processing in the food chain. And as you can see, it's saying real sustainability will only be possible by consuming less. That makes sense. Effectively, that really means that we have to consume less energy, etc. That's usually what we think about, reducing carbon and so on. Food prints, for instance, one of the projects that's going to be talked about later, has a description on a project page that says that it's about eating food with less carbon. And we're actually going to be talking about types of food that have less carbon in them as an indicator of heading towards greenness, just by looking at food composition as opposed to the energy that goes into making them. So that's hence the slogan, eat less, mostly plants. Well, how do we get to consuming less without us starving? It turns out there's a simple focus that we can look at, and that's whole food. So if we think about the notion of green food and green food tech actually being driven by green food, then we're moving to a success point of change. And I hope for the rest of this talk to be able to show you why this argument makes sense. So whole food, occasionally we've been in grocery stores where we've seen food like this. This one is actually taken from the States because, as you might notice in the UK, there's a tendency to put whole food like this inside little plastic packages. That's always confused me. Do any of you know why they do that? Is it because people aren't to be trusted counting in low numbers? Like, here I want 3 of these. I don't know. So this is also getting closer to the source, that if you're lucky and you guys are in London, you might have access to open-air markets where you can actually get a little closer to where the food is coming in from rather than going to a grocery store. I was very happy to spend some time in Cambridge this summer where they had daily open-air markets. Amazing. It almost felt like being in France, except for the accent and the cyclists that nearly tried to kill you every day. Other than that, the contrast is, if I can move back and forth a little bit, is that this is what real food looks like. This is what, I don't know, pseudo-food looks like. And one might ask, that are these colors the colors of food? Let's do it again. Here's what we just saw. Real food, packaging. You can also tell them apart because they need labels on them to tell you what kind of food they are, because otherwise they'd be indistinguishable containers for the most part. We'll come on to why labels have evolved and why they're sort of dangerous, if you will, and not indicators of health necessarily. That wasn't their motivation. So what's the issue with processed foods versus whole foods? Why am I going on about this? Well, you can think about the cost of translating a food into a processed food, and by processing, generally speaking, any of the stuff you see in these images has had components of the food removed. So there's a cost involved with that kind of processing. And then once the food is removed, usually something's done to it to increase its shelf life and to make it quicker to cook. So there are all sorts of chemical processes that are going on with this and packaging and so on. Now, this could be heard as me already saying that all processed or packaged foods are evil. I'm not quite ready to go right to that point yet. I'm hoping we might stand there for a moment a little later. But right now, by processed foods, we're talking about this notion of where stuff is being radically taken out of the food and other things being put into the food to make it feel like food. You all probably know what the biggest attribute of low-fat food is and why low-fat food is often calorically higher than just regular fat food. It's what goes into the food to replace the fat, to keep the food having the texture that a full-fat food would have. So looking at, say, low-fat mayonnaise as an example, you can see that generally speaking it's calorically higher and it's got a lot of filler in it. Anytime something's removed, generally the food industry puts something back in to give you the semblance of the taste that you had. So why bother to take out the fat, you might ask? Because the consumer believes that fat is the big bad, and so by taking it out, the food becomes safer to sell in larger quantity. And there's nothing wrong with the illusion of it having a lower caloric content as well, so pushing more product. This is a typical basket in the UK when folks go shopping, and all that I'm trying to show here is that not the person in the jeans, because that's not usually the birth of somebody in the UK who's carrying a basket like this. But it's that, again, that whole food, or something that looks like a complete item that hasn't been put into a package, actually is in the basket. And I would encourage you all to take a look the next time you do go to a grocery store, is to just see what's in the baskets in front of you and behind you while you're waiting in line. Do a little ethnographic survey and just see what percentage of the food coming out of those baskets is actually processed in some way or packaged in some way. I hope to be able to show you some examples of safer packaged foods and why they're okay, but these kinds, not so much. This, especially, is an example of a highly processed food. And as you can see from the stat on the slide, this meal is typical for 1 in 4 meals in the US, and processed food, of which this is an example, sort of the Uber example, fast food and processed food, makes up 65% of the calories consumed in the UK. It's 70% in North America, so fortunately we're one place behind the US right now, but it's not a great category to be in. I'm about to get to why consuming so much processed food is problematic in terms of the goal of consuming less and having lower costs on the environment. So the main thing to take away from this image, however, is that there are significant colors missing. That when we get into highly processed foods, not only do we remove attributes of those foods, which we might look at as nutrients and important things, we also start to pull out colors and put in usually crap. It's that simple, is that we put in low quality fillers into, say, the burger that we're looking at. Recently you might have heard that Subway has been putting yoga mats into their bread products. That has recently become illegal in the States, and now Subway has said that they're going to stop doing that, but it's been found in other foods. So there's a lot of filler and there's a lot of fake fats, for instance, in the fries that you're seeing here, which is a shame. McDonald's French fries smell so good, and they have this craving quality to them, but but they are in themselves kind of craven because of the trans fats and cheap fats that are used to cook these things are not well processed by our bodies. So it's not just that they're high cal, it's the type of stuff that's in them that does not go well with our physiology. So one of the colors that is missing here, if I dared to ask, what are some of the colors you're sensing are not in this image? Beautiful. Really, green is that really, really, really fundamental color. It's a color of life. It shows that there's protein present. It shows that there's all sorts of cool things present. When green is missing from anywhere, you can kind of think death. So two things are missing here, this notion of greenness and life, and this notion of wholeness. And so the concept of swap like for like is one I'd like to park here, is to suggest that an approach to helping people who are living in this space to move away from this towards better, healthier, lower carbon types of foods is to think about how they could replace some of the stuff in these images with whole food alternatives. Not just homemade, but whole food, because how these ingredients are made is important, so that's something to think about. Something else that we start to see that I was mentioning before as food gets processed is the real absence of colors here that shows us processing costs. Just the multiplicity of ingredients that we start to see on food labels is indicative of the degree of processing, the degree of cost, the degree of subsidies, and the complete lack of any natural food benefit left. This is on a package of bread, as you can imagine from some of the ingredients that you might recognize. And you'll see that there's bleached flour, and these elements they claim are being added. There's no evidence to suggest that artificially reintroducing vitamins into food is necessarily being processed the same way those vitamins would be processed if they were there naturally. The second ingredient in this product is sugar. Then I don't know how you make artificial blueberries, but it's something with a lot of sugar in it, and probably one of the worst oils or fats imaginable for people, which is cottonseed oil, made from the things that our clothing is made out of, and yet somehow that is kind of edible. And then we get in bread more corn flour, dried egg whites, all sorts of processing, and anytime you see corn, you can think subsidized crops. In the States, anytime you see corn, you think GMO or Frankenfood. Again, there are high costs associated with this kind of farming, as we understand, and also the notion that we are privileging a particular monoculture kind of crop, which I could just talk all day about. So again, we need to think about not only what color is missing from a black and white label, everything, and is that indicative of what's missing from the item in the box. Sort of the longer the label is, likely the less food there is. So how do we start to think about swapping like for like? Well, here's a quick note about food labels, is that they weren't started to give consumers information about what was in the food. It was started in two things. You were talking about beer earlier. Food labels were initially introduced to show people that people were not poisoning them with crap in either their beer or their bread, because this had been a real problem in some areas, and people had been put to death for screwing around with the neighborhood's beer. And some of you who are drinking it this evening might appreciate that. If you muck around with your beer or your bread, you're dead. We don't take quite that view of labels anymore, but maybe we should think about that, because if you need these kind of labels to prove that you're eating food, what does that tell us about the state of food? So again, to relate this back to the topic, the higher the processing, if we go back to the origin of why labels were on food, it's there as an attempt to prove that this is unmolested product. Perhaps there's protesting too much. The irony comes in when we start to see labels on things like this. Most people's label for what we're looking at here is this. So what's happened? What's gone wrong that we've moved from this notion of a whole food like this to going towards crap, like we see in the right-hand corner here? Some of the excuses I hear quite often are that we no longer have time for eating real food. And I guess part of the question is this a false economy? Is this a false model? And in whose interest is it that we believe that we have to have this kind of canned food in order to live? And what does that do for our lives in terms of relationship to consumption and cost and being green anyway? What do we need to know here? I'd like to take the next little bit of talk to give us some food facts. First of all, one of my favorite points is that whole food doesn't take a lot of time to cook. I was going to show you this 20-second video by Julia Child that demonstrates how anybody really can cook an egg in 20 seconds. Voila, whole food. Behind it is spinach. Pour some hot water over some spinach. It's wilted. It goes great with the whole egg. So you've got, in 30 seconds, effectively a meal. So the notion that cooking food takes too long and cooking whole food costs too much, where are those beliefs coming from? These are legitimate beliefs. I hear them all the time, but they're not based on tested fact. So here's another thing that is a fact that I would like to show you. I'm just going to take a second to switch to a video. I'd like to show you the rat on sugar. Let me give you a little bit of a prep for this about why I'm showing you this. One of the biggies about processed food is that it takes stuff out of the food, as we've been talking about. What's left is often what are considered extremely easy to digest carbohydrates, fast sugars. These are great for a fast energy hit, but when they're unmitigated by anything else, too much sugar in our bloodstream is bad not only for our metabolism, in that it slows us down, and also really refined and processed food with effectively a high carbohydrate content also lets us know, or actually stops us from knowing that we're full. A lot of sugar, high carbohydrates do not trigger us that we've eaten. It's a hormone called leptin. It doesn't get fired up. And so we keep eating and can effectively be gorging ourselves trying to feel full on this stuff, and we just won't. Because it doesn't have the cues in the food to let us know that we're full. But the biggie of the rat in the tank here, this is actually about what too much sugar or too much processed food does to the brain. Let me see if I can switch this around for us. I'm just going to switch over here to a different screen for you to see the video of the rat in the brain. We're on sugar. So here is our happy little rat. This is a rat on a regular diet. And you'll notice that it takes about 5 seconds for it to find its little island. Yay, it's been trained the day before, and finds its island. Here's a rat on a North American high-carb, high-glucose diet. You have days like this? It's trying desperately to find the island. That's its mission. Whoa! Directionally impaired rat. Okay, let's see it go one more time. This time, if you can see it, it's going to literally run into it. Yep, that's how some of my students work. Okay, so we've all had experiences like this, but that is effectively the brain on too much sugar. So the point here is that not only is processed food really problematic for us in terms of our well-being, physiologically, in terms of not feeling full and so on. I'm just looking for the screen I want to show you again. Here we go. It's bad for our brains, which means that our quality of life is going to be impaired. So here's a couple of things to think about. Is that we need, as designers and people concerned about well-being, to help people connect with whole food. Because here's a simple heuristic. If we're eating more whole food, we get more of those cues to tell us that we're full, we consume less. Engaging in a richer variety of foods means that we're also not relying so much on the monoculture foods that are going on in processed foods. We eat less, we have higher variety of nutrients from a wider distribution of foods that can be sourced from different locations, also driving down carbon costs. We're starting to perform better because we're getting a richer variety of nutrients. Some of the strategies we might want to consider are to get to 50-50 from the current 65-35% of processed food to whole food. If we just get to 50-50 as a starting point, we will be improving quality of food, reducing consumption, getting healthier. And that's a knock-on cost effect as well. That if we can improve quality of the food that people are eating, that we're eating ourselves, and thus improve our brain performance as well as our physiology, we're going to be more productive at work, we're going to sleep better and recover better, and we're going to need the NHS less. That's my only motivation for working out, is to stay out of the NHS. The question here is cui bono. Who benefits by promoting this processed food approach and this, all the beliefs around it, like there's no time to cook food, buy food, etc. Who's interested in that compared to dealing with whole food? That's something we need to part. What do we know? Here's a quickie. 5 simple heuristics about connecting with food and our well-being. There are 5 core processes that are required for life around our bodies, and I've been trying to put these little bits into this picture. So in the upper left, we've got these guys going to work in their suits, they're moving. Movement is a fundamental process that the body requires. We can eat all the calcium and protein we want. Our bones won't get stronger and our muscles won't get bigger just by eating those nutrients. We have to move to drive up the need to metabolize that food to build new tissue. Otherwise, our bodies are extremely efficient. The more sedentary we are, the more material is removed from our body because it costs the body to maintain that tissue, so it's going to get rid of it if it doesn't need it. So the next thing after movement that we need is sleep. Many people who say they have to pull an all-nighter, etc., to be able to stick up with something, again, might be false economy. The best thing that I encourage my students to do is when they're feeling that way, is to go for a walk. It will help reduce their stress. It will help literally clear their mind. And it will help them to sleep, where the kinds of things that happen in sleep are our memories are processed. So we're actually building new knowledge when we sleep, which is sometimes why people wake up with their ideas sorted. That kind of processing goes on. If we don't have that, can't finish the task. The next thing that's actually really critical on our list of 5 is to socialize deeply. This, a coach of mine once said, the harder you work out, the harder you need to socialize afterwards, the more intensely you need to party. And there's kind of a balance there. As long as when we are socializing, we are engaging deliberately. This is based on research around mortality, that the better the quality of our relationships with others in the physical world, the better our health, the longer our life. There's no research right now that is showing that online engagement has any of the same benefits for mortality as longer life. I got it, I can do it in 2. The next point, again, is food. Why we need that, I'm not going to go over that again, but our whole bodies require these good nutrients to think. And the last little bit there, as I've touched on a bit, is the brain, is that we need to also practice cogitating deeply, learning new skills. Research is showing that the more we actively engage the brain to challenge it to think new thoughts, the more we actually protect the brain itself against disease. What does this have to do, again, with reducing the cost of consumption? By keeping our bodies well-tuned, by moving, eating well, resting ourselves, engaging with others, engaging our brains, we're actually effectively making better use of the resources around us, giving back into a quality of life, and by staying healthy, consuming less. So this is part of the process of being healthier, responsible people. The challenge, however, to get to this less is how do we design, this is where the HCI part comes in and where the question of how does technology help here, how do we help each other get to less? Where does the technology need to be deployed? And again, there's kind of a challenge here, is that if we want to design to make better quality of life normal, and to seek for examples of that, for instance, I've been looking at research that shows, gosh, if you put sit-stand desks in people's environments, they're far more likely to use them and gain the benefits of standing and moving during the day than if those things aren't there. How do we do simple design choices like that to make green accessible and believable that there's time to do this and value in doing this? How do we promote that design to improve moving towards foods that will satisfy us and thus let us eat less and perform better? So these are kinds of the challenges that actually thinking about why do we actually want to move towards green or whole food in design are important. I'm going to give you a couple little takeaways, and my takeaway slide is gone. I'll tell you what they are then. Okay, this is the time for the sock puppets when you don't have your slide. A couple of the takeaways here is that we need to think about, as it says right here, making better normal as opposed to relying on the status quo. With respect to the current status quo is towards sedentarism and processed food. That means that it's not fair to put the whole emphasis of our design and energy, if you will, onto the individual, because there's an entire structure ranged against the individual not to practice like this. So how do we engage with infrastructure to change the status quo to one that supports normal being better than what it is right now, which is unhealthy? If we can address the policy level, the infrastructure level, and then support the individual's beliefs, then we can get to this notion of green food technology through green food. And I guarantee, if you give this a try yourself for the next 2 weeks, you'll feel better, perform better, and just be nicer human beings. That's all.
Cool, thank you.